I just always think about those feelings, what they have, you know, the scared feelings and you know, not knowing what's going to happen.
What does happen next will have repercussions for 250 years.
And so it's as they approach, there's a kind of a standoff.
And that's when the two warriors challenged the landing.
And actually make it clear that it's not okay to come ashore.
They threw spears and stones at them as that morning, and the reaction by the British was similar to what they've done in other places, and that was to fire upon them. One was hit in the leg. They retrieved back and got the shield, and then obviously more muskets were fired and they were overwhelmed, and at that point the shield was dropped and collected.
Collected and taken back to those billowing sails of that ship. The vessel would only stay in that bay for another 8 days before disappearing north up the coast. A ship that bore the name Endeavour. Congratulations, Australia. You just got discovered by the British. In the days of the Empire, objects were taken. Objects that tell us about the world we have today. My name is Mark Fennell. And this is stuff the British stole. Right now I am about 5 hours south of Sydney, and I'm driving through, I think, what can best be described as a cathedral of black and burnt out trees. And I'm on my way to investigate something that I first heard about back in the UK. So this whole project started with historian Alice Proctor. Both of us were born in Australia, but we were sitting in this Hogwartsian London library. So I asked her, what was the Australian object I should look for?
I would say the Griego Shield, which you might be familiar with. It is in the British Museum collection, and apparently it was picked up by Captain Cook and Joseph Banks on their first day at what is now Botany Bay. The kind of text of the label in the British Museum says, when Cook landed at Botany Bay in 1770, 2 men came forward with spears. Cook fired shot, hitting a man in the leg. The men retreated, dropping a shield. It has been suggested, but not confirmed, that this is that shield. First contacts in the Pacific were often tense and violent.
Really doesn't reflect all that great on Captain Cook now, does it?
No, it doesn't. But I mean, this was his kind of main negotiating tactic. He would often fire a gun and deal with the consequences rather than attempt to meet people in a peaceful and maybe friendly way. It's a pretty violent interaction. You know, they don't say what happened, but if you're an Indigenous person in 1770 and you've just been shot by a British naval officer, you're going to die of your injuries, right? So there's this whole kind of history of undescribed violence. Just from a material point of view, a shield is a defensive weapon. And when that is the first object of the first encounter between Indigenous people on the east coast of Australia and British invading arrivals, and the kind of relic of that moment is a shield, that says so much, because it's how you protect yourself. It's a really symbolic object.
But it's not just the symbolism. There is an actual campaign to bring that shield back to Australia.
It's being led by a man called Rodney Kelly, who is the descendant of one of the people that was on that beach that day. And so he has a very legitimate claim to wanting this shield back.
And Rodney lives somewhere through this cathedral of trees. Walking up the hill to Rodney's place, he's leaning on the veranda, looking out at the singed landscape all around us.
Yeah, no, we're at Gweigal. No, we just had a recent bushfire. This whole town was just surrounded in flames, and 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning it was like 40, 50 degrees, just a whole mountain range.
Rodney has traced his ancestry through his great-great-grandmother back to the Gweigal clan, the people who lived on what we now call Botany Bay. Rodney claims he has a baptism record linking her to a warrior by the name of Cumin.
and that was the man who was standing there that day with the spears and shield in 1770 when Cook arrived. So we were the first people there. So yeah, that's why I'm so into trying to get these items back for my ancestors, because something terrible happened to them.
According to Rodney, it was in 2016 that he found his moment. So for a brief second, that shield did return to Australia. It's part of an exhibition in Canberra. And so Rodney, he hopped in his car, drove a couple of hours to see it face to face.
It's about a metre tall. It's not that wide. Looks very, very old.
Imagine something almost the shape of an almond, but large enough to cover your torso and made of this faded red wood bearing centuries of wear and tear.
When you see it, you can see ochre in it. So you can see white ochre, how it's been burnt, charcoal in it.
And right in the middle, just big enough to put your thumb through, is a hole.
Yeah, it's been shot, with a projectile of some type, it's just been shot.
It was on the final day of the exhibition when Rodney said he did something no one expected. In the middle of the museum in Canberra, in front of a crowd, he staked his claim.
And we're here today to let everybody know that we want the return of our ancestors' shield. It does not belong to the British. It does not belong to the British Museum. These artefacts, they belong in their own homeland.
Rodney went on to demand that all artefacts currently held by the British Museum were to be returned within 90 days. That didn't happen.
As soon as I'd done that protest, they just, locked it away, packed it up and straight back to England.
But as it flew back to England, the shield had someone on its tail.
They knew I was coming.
Rodney decided to follow the shield back to the UK and this time make his claim on British soil.
I'd organised a meeting with the British Museum.
How was that conversation?
I'd rocked up with a QC, Queen's Counsel, and they didn't like what he had to say. They spoke nicely to me, but the QC comes out and he talks about the law and stuff. You could just see their faces and they snapped back to him, and it was good seeing, the British Museum sort of, stepping back and whoa, that was a good time.
Now, it's worth pointing out here that Rodney doesn't want to claim the Griego Shield back for himself, per se. He just wants the shield in an Australian museum.
It would mean a lot to have the shield back. For Aboriginal people, it's our symbol of resistance.
He's not seeking the shield for sort of personal gain. It's very much about trying to put it on display and use it to tell that story and have it available to young people and school kids and people who can actually connect to that history, but connect to it in Australia in the right sort of place for it.
Rodney brought a lawyer with him, but in reality, he needed to bring more than half of the UK Parliament because the British Museum collection is protected by the British Museum Act.
So it's politically protected, and in order to change the repatriation policy, there'd have to be a change of law. And the fact is that no one's done that. It's hard to bring a case against these institutions. In some cases, you have to do things like prove cultural continuity, which is to say this object means the same thing to me as it did to my ancestors 200 years ago, which is very difficult to do when those 200 years have been shaped by, colonialism or white supremacy and things like that. It's often really hard to say this means the same to me as it did to my ancestor.
If your continuous culture is interrupted by a colonial force coming in and reshaping a country, which, being Australian, we would have no idea about whatsoever, I don't even know how you begin to execute that line of argument.
I mean, it's basically impossible.
So instead, on his now multiple crowd-funded visits to the UK, Rodney goes kind of rogue.
And I started thinking, let's start a stolen goods tour. Let's bring other cultures in and let's make this tour just to educate people about items in this museum, and they're getting educated by the people where those items are from. The first one, a couple hundred people.
Wait, so you're walking around the British Museum with a couple of hundred people in tow, pointing out all the things that are stolen. Is that how this went down?
Yeah, so There was myself, security guards just everywhere, going crazy. This shield means a lot to me and my people. It tells me and my people who we are and where we come from.
Not long after all this goes down, Rodney's back in Australia, and he gets some disturbing news. It seems the shield is no longer in its cabinet.
I had a person message me and say, look, the shield's not on display, something's going on. So I, asked what's going on, and they've been starting to work on questioning, is the shield really from 1770 and, this and that. So.
Wait, so you do your speech, pull all this attention, and then a year after that it disappears from display and they start investigating whether or not it is in fact the thing that you claim. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. The timing of it is all just so wrong. Like, once somebody comes along and says, this belongs to the people, then they turn around and say, this might not belong to you. This might not be the shield from 1770. Why didn't they do this research prior to somebody making a claim on it? Yeah.
That's a very good and very fair question. After decades of sitting quietly in a British museum, why did they choose now to ask the question of whether it really was the Griego Shield?
Well, people keep calling it the Gweigal Shield, I understand that. And I keep telling people, its origin is there's still a lot of speculation around it. Okay, it's recording.
This is the voice of Dr. Shane Williams.
I worked in universities for quite a while, teaching Indigenous studies.
He's a Dunghutti and Dharawal man from the La Perouse area, around Botany Bay. That's Gweigal country. And when he saw that shield for the first time, Shane had a very different reaction to Rodney.
It looked unusually peculiar in terms of its shape and colour. So it was a red colour, and I was never aware of any red shields, in the Botany Bay area. So I actually asked the people in the British Museum if they could have somebody test the wood, because small bits of it fall off over time anyway, and they came back and they said it was made from red mangrove.
Here's the problem. Red mangrove?
Doesn't grow in Sydney Basin. It doesn't start growing until you get as far as where Port Macquarie is.
That's just under 400 kilometres north.
And it's in abundance up in places like Ballina.
700 kilometres north of Sydney.
So it's very likely that shield's origin is somewhere between Port Macquarie and far north Queensland.
So that wood could have come from anywhere along a 2,400 kilometre stretch of coastland, but probably not from Botany Bay. When the Endeavour sailed away from that cove after 8 days, it sailed north.
And we know that Cook, when he left this part of the country, he hit a reef off Townsville, and he anchored at what's now called Endeavour River at a place called Cooktown, named after him, of course. And he was there for a good 6 weeks, So it's very likely that the shield is from there.
Now, for Rodney Kelly, and I should say he is not alone in this view, there is a very simple explanation for all of this. That shield was a trade.
We had a very sophisticated trading network. So I've had people tell me about stories of tribes from that region travelling to Sydney to trade. That's still passed on now. So there is no reason why a piece of wood that comes from up there shouldn't be in Sydney through the trade route.
It's very hard to reconstruct trade networks, particularly from around the sort of Sydney coastal region, but it is a possibility. There's one sort of issue if they are already making shields around Botany Bay from a different type of mangrove. Why would you need to trade in a red mangrove one, unless it has, perhaps other ceremonial significance. So, I mean, that's a possibility. But I mean, all these things are possibilities.
I've come to the nation's capital of Canberra to meet Maria Nugent. So when Shane and Rodney raised questions about the origins of the shield, the museum did indeed launch their own investigation. One of the resulting papers was co-written by Dr. Nugent, this lady here.
My name's Maria Nugent and I'm a historian at the ANU.
While Maria Nugent is non-Indigenous, she has been working in this area for decades. She does, however, choose her words very, very carefully. All right, so here's a not at all thorny question. Does Rodney's claims, in your view, stack up?
I'm gonna. So you probably include all of that, and ahhing.
I think so, yeah. I think we'll definitely include that. I think that sums up just how difficult it is to make a pronouncement like this.
So which aspects of Rodney's claim are we interested in?
In truth, Maria is 100% right to be wary, because the more you look into claims about this shield, the murkier the picture gets. There is that hole in the shield that many people tell me is evidence of a musket being fired. What am I missing?
It's been looked at kind of quite closely. Some of that work was done by the British Museum when Shane and other people in the Raparu's Aboriginal community asked the British Museum to do more research to see whether there might be traces, I think, of gunpowder or something, and the conclusion was no.
A guy from the army, he actually examined the hole, and he's actually fired these sorts of muskets as well. And he said it's not from a musket. Otherwise, it would have blasted the back of the shield out, like any other bullet does, puts a hole in something, but it blows the back out. Well, there was none of that,
We felt strongly enough from that sort of evidence that it's not a hole made from a gunshot.
A lot of journalists and non-journalists alike would like to believe that hole is actually a bullet hole. However, there's many shields that have similar puncture holes in them.
The kind of question for me is, if we proved it one way or the other, would it really make any difference to its symbolic significance, which it's acquired over the last 15, 60 years, and in a more intensive way in the last 5 to 10 years. Shields, early shields are incredibly valuable, but...
Whether it's that important shields, we may not know for a while.
Well, I think we should try and loosen this idea that things associated with Cook have greater value than other things.
Well, I guess because Cook himself occupies such an important part of the white narrative of Australia, that the idea that there is an artefact from the moment of his first encounter with Indigenous Australians, I do get why that has narrative importance. Am I getting this horribly wrong?
So one way to answer that is to compare the interest in the shield and the interest in the spears. So we know that Cook and his men took, because they record in their journals that they took 40 or 50. So we know that 4 of those spears survive also from that encounter.
So why do you think they're treated differently? Like, why is there so much more debate around a shield than there is around the spears? Why do you think that is?
So the fact that it's a shield.
A shield is a symbol of defence.
So it really does embody or engender that idea that he was an assault that you had to defend yourself against, in the sense that there are conquerors and victims. So it fits much more into that image that we have. But that's what repatriation does, right? It means that when claims are made, things need to be looked at more closely.
If you go to that shoreline where the Endeavour made first contact today, it's quiet.
You know, usually we're sitting here and you're hearing planes fly over us every couple of minutes. You're seeing container ships coming in left, right and centre.
Thanks to the pandemic, the nearby Sydney airport and shipping terminal have ground to a virtual halt.
We've seen a lot of more aquatic activity, a lot of more birds and stuff activity around our cultural area.
Whereas the people, they're nowhere to be seen.
You know, just hearing no activity, you could close your eyes and really think, well, hey, this is what it would have been 250 years ago.
For this brief moment in time, you get this flash of an undiscovered country, a bay that would have been alive with stingrays, dolphins and more.
Buriburi, which is our spirit ancestor, the humpback whale as well, would have come in and they used to rest on the beaches, and at night they would actually sing. It was like they were singing to each other.
So my name's Nolene Timbry. I'm the chairperson of the Laperouse Local Aboriginal Land Council.
My name's Ray Ingray. I'm from the Laperouse Aboriginal community as well as Nolene. I'm the deputy chairperson of the Laperouse Local Aboriginal Land Council and chairperson of the Gweigal Foundation.
Nolene and Ray are, well, just like Rodney, they are descendants of the people of this cove. But they've arrived at a slightly different view of the shield.
So for me, I guess, I'm not convinced that the shield on display in the British Museum is the shield that was collected here 250 years ago, but I'm not convinced that it's not either. It's still a little bit contentious for me. If the British Museum, what their testing and what their opinion is that it's not the Griego Shield, as it's been called, firstly, they've got it displayed incorrectly. Secondly, it probably loses a bit of value for them because it's not, if they're saying it's not the shield that was collected at that time. But for us, it's still a 250-year-old plus shield, and it hasn't lost that cultural value for us. It's a strong cultural item that talks about our history and our connection and our cultural ties to this land.
In case you're wondering, we did actually spend weeks trying to get the British Museum to explain why they thought the shield should remain their property. And their argument is, well, it's basically the same argument they use for everything.
I think it's important that such an object tells a story of the British and of Aboriginal Australia. And to me personally, I think it's very important that the very deep history of Australia is understood not just in Australia, but around the world. And by having exhibits of material in Britain, it does disseminate that history.
That's Gay Sculthorpe, Oceania Director with the British Museum, talking to me from London. And yes, she is Australian and an Indigenous woman herself. Thing is, even Nolene, standing at Botany Bay, as much as she wants the shield returned back to Australia, even she acknowledges that it does bind the two countries together.
If it wasn't taken at that time and if it wasn't held in organisations such as the British Museum, it wouldn't be around today. It would have disintegrated. We wouldn't have it. But we do, or they do.
It is a complicated situation that it's intricately tied to the story of dispossession in this country, but the only reason it exists is because the British took it, right?
It is a very complicated time to find ourselves in. If they hadn't have taken it, then it wouldn't be here. But if they hadn't have come, then it wouldn't have.
Probably wouldn't have been as significant, right?
Exactly. So it's a marker of a time in history.
According to Nolene and Ray, once again, Maria Nugent was right. I have been fixating on the wrong object. If you want a symbol of dispossession on this land, it's not the shield. It was the spears that Cook and his men stole by the dozens.
If you look at how people lived off this water, bundling all those spears, 40 to 50 spears up, that's just like shutting down a Woolworths or a Coles these days because they needed that to spear fish, they needed that to survive and feed their families.
Right. The spears are food. Spears are the key to keeping a community going, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, realistically, they were taking away food source.
So wait, so where am I looking here? Where am I looking?
Through the pier there, through the wharf there,
Nolene and Ray have taken me up to the waterline because they want to show me something.
There's a red or bright orange buoy.
Oh, yeah. If you stand right on the edge of this water, you can still see the spot those sails came to a halt.
You can see it through there, that big one. That big one, yeah.
It's right there in the middle.
That's the marker, yeah.
The Endeavour's anchor point has been marked in the water.
And unfortunately, every 4 years, they either replace the buoy or they just paint it with a brighter red colour, and it just keeps annoying us. But that's all right.
Yeah, make it nice and bright for us.
For a long time, that bobbing red marker and a sullen obelisk dedicated to Captain Cook were really the main and most obvious signals of the importance of this place. But almost nothing speaks of the loss, of the resistance. That is, until quite recently.
They're sitting on the rock. They're made of bronze, so they're starting to change in colour a bit.
In April 2020, as most of us were in some form of lockdown, a handful of objects were placed around this bay. A series of statues and artworks.
Looks like a holdout boat. Also looks like a whale, the remains of a whale on its back.
Rising out of the water are these 7 U-shaped twists of metal. They symbolise those same humpback whales that once beached here. They're also based on the size and shape of the Endeavour itself.
There's also some durable wording, and there's also some quotes from Cook's own diary.
It's really, it's almost brutal in a way. It's almost like a sharp metal skeleton sticking out of the water. There's something sad about it.
There's mixed feelings, this place. This is where we were annexed to the British Empire and the start of what then became known as the invasion for us. But it's also a place to reflect and go, hey, we're here 250 years later still.
Listening to everybody, it's striking that no object, not a shield, spear, this beautiful bronze artwork in the water here that's definitely trying to juggle a bunch of competing historic narratives, none of them can really contain the complexity of what happened here. And that's sort of true of every one of the objects we've encountered, from Tipu's tiger to the Benin bronzes to this. Each of them is a doorway, right? Once you see them and you know they exist, you can step through. You can learn more. But really, it's up to us to decide just how much of that history, our history, do we really want to face?
What happened here 250 years ago, I think gives us all a tie to it, but it also gives us that respect and responsibility and pride, the fact that we are still here, we are still connected to this country.
Despite being ground zero of colonisation, our families have adapted over those, the last 200 years or so. We've survived, we're here, and we're still a people that are trying to find our way in this world.
Stuff the British Stole was produced by Zoe Ferguson and myself. The executive producer is Amrutha Slee, and Julie Browning is the head of Society and Culture. Mixing by Martin Peralta. This is the last episode of Season 1 of Stuff the British Stole, but have you ever walked past an object in a museum and wondered, how did that get there? I would like to hear from you. Maybe there's a doorway there. Stolen.
There you go. Happy Invasion Day. – 26th of January. Kind of interesting that after 250 years of displaying that shield as the Gweigal Shield, all of a sudden when somebody claims it, oh no, it's probably not the Gweigal Shield, it's probably just a shield. Why would you say it's just a shield? Oh, well, it's made out of red mangrove, and the further south the red mangrove tree grows is couple of 100 miles north of Sydney. And as every proper little Euro peon white supremacist is taught with their mother's milk, Aborigines were A, supposedly nomadic, which means they didn't live anywhere in particular, and B, they only lived in their own area. They didn't ever travel or trade or do anything like that. It's kind of like an article of faith among the white blindfold view of colonial history. But as far as I can recall reading in New Scientist magazine, and I've been reading that for 25 years, about 10,000 years ago, the Aborigines sort of gave up on stone blades, as in basalt, because they moved to quartz or flint. You know, there was something better, and that was quartz. Quartz blades, they can be made, if you know what you're doing, to be sharper than surgical steel scalpels. They're very small, but they're very sharp. And there was one quarry and a knife-making factory up near Darwin in the Northern Territory, and quartz knives from there were found around Melbourne by the early settlers on the southern coast of the mainland beside the beach of the Bass Strait. There were commercial gardens for a native plant that had a very high nicotine content called tidgery, and another one called pidgery. And they were about 50, 60 miles northwest of here, up sort of around the Queensland border. There are still surviving patches up there, unless they've been wiped out by the bushfires. But it was a kind of a ceremonial herb, you know, there was enough nicotine in it to make your head spin. So therefore, if you were given it by a shaman with a lot of traditional incantations and rituals and established behaviour, then yeah, it was part of the spiritual side of life. But it was also traded all over the continent. The idea that because a shield, which was found at Sydney Cove, couldn't possibly have come from Sydney Cove because it was from a tree that grew 200 miles away. I don't know, I had the idea that Cook said he brought back a shield and spears. Banks said they brought back a shield and spears. They've still got some of the spears and they've got a shield. As to whether somebody decided to improve the tail by shooting, or rather drilling a half-inch hole in the shield, or a three-quarter-inch hole, I think 0.755 or something of an inch would be the Brown Bess musket calibre. And what the archaeologist or the historian said, talking about the ballistic expert looking at the shield, it may be right. I have no doubt that if you got a piece of wood, the bloke who knows about ballistics, having fired Brown Bess muskets, is probably not familiar with, and fired a Brown Bess musket at it, it would probably knock splinters out of the exit wound side of the hole. I'm not disputing that. It's fair enough to suspect that somebody may have drilled a clean hole in the shield if it doesn't have any normal indications of an exit wound. To make the story better, they may well have thought that, well, they may have thought they were making the story better, because the thing is, my understanding from hearing it read and spoken about on the radio, previous documentaries I have encountered, what Cook's supposed to have done was fired 3 times at the 2 Aboriginal warriors who stood up to him at Kurnell, with everybody else hiding back out of sight behind the sand dunes. And he's supposed, according to what I've heard, he's supposed to have fired 1 Brown Bess musket to the left of the men, and it kicked up a spurt of sand, and they heard the muzzle report and they didn't think much about it, didn't connect it. So he fired another brown bess musket. Bear in mind, it takes, half a minute or so to load them if you're an expert and you've got everything right there ready to go. So he just grabs another musket from one of the Marines because he had a boatload of bloody Marine troops to guard the convicts. So he fires one, deliberately misses, kicks up sand. Fires another one on the other side of him, deliberately misses, kicks up sand. Both the two Aboriginal warriors stood their ground. Then he asked for a musket to be loaded with birdshot. Now, birdshot, instead of having one great big lead ball 3/4 of an inch in diameter, which is going to go straight through you and break any bones it encounters and do truly major damage, and as the woman said, an Aborigine shot by a brown bess musket would die. And if you're holding the shield in front of yourself and there's a 3/4 inch hole in the centre of the shield, then the bullet wouldn't have slowed down very much for the shield at all. It would probably still gone through a person. But birdshot, tiny little lead pellets that are designed not to spoil the meat when you shoot a duck. They're normally fired out of shotguns, but they go pretty much identically well in any cylinder bore muzzle loading firearm. Flintlock, percussion cap, whatever it is. So Cook then fires his birdshot at the two Aborigines. And according to, I think it was Banks's account, he deliberately fired below the shield, hitting them, one in particular, in the shins with birdshot at 50 metres, 75 metres. That would be enough to put the pellets through the skin and not hurt the bone and probably not go into the muscle. It would be a painful wound that would probably get infected and fester up, and you might be able to dig it out with a thorn or one of your quartz blades. But it would not leave this 3/4 inch hole in the centre of the shield. So if it is the Gweigal Shield, then somebody has improved its provenance by drilling a 3/4 inch hole in it. But maybe the Gweigal Shield was used for firelighters at a drunken party 100 years ago, and this is just a Aboriginal shield that somebody has drilled a hole in, and they've put it up in the British Museum to say, ha, look what we have, the lasting relic of the first time the British Navy met an Australian Aborigine. We shot him and took his shield. That's entirely within the encompass of what the British think is a clever way to portray their own history. See, they're proud. They are boastful of having stolen the world and destroyed it on the run. Raid, smash, and grab it all today is the way of the Euro-peons. And don't forget, a peon is a landless, ignorant peasant, and Euro means from Europe comes. Pretty much sums it up. Got a bit of a treat for you here. Previously prepared, you might say, although I didn't prepare to record the video. Let's get a different angle. I think we'll have to go different again. That's a bit more betterer, but it's still in silhouette. Here we see the actual Boomerang carving stone, which came out of a gully 30 miles east of here, 50 kilometres. As you can see, it has some exquisitely carefully shaped faces and facets and edges. Perfectly formed for shaping and scraping and profiling the aerofoils of a boomerang. And not only, but also the boomerang carving stone with its blade tip aerofoil scrapers, as well as its centre of the aerofoil section scraper. It also happens to have, conveniently, a pretty fair sort of a spoke shave with which to round and smooth a spear shaft. And like the proverbial Swiss Army knife, in order to put the dimple, the knock, to hold the tooth, the throwing spike of a woomera, it's sadly broken off or ground down with age. But when this thing was new, it had a three-cornered drill bit on the top of it. And like I said, around here, and this appears to be some form of a granite, bloody hard rock to work. But it's a sedimentary metamorphic rock. So I don't see how you could make it any other way but by working it. And around here, there's a pretty good quartz mine at Kingsgate, only about 30 kilometres south of where this came from. So this is something that would have been probably obsolete 10,000 years ago. And yet, it not only fits the boomerang that I made, haven't got a date on it, but from memory that would be 25 years ago. It also fits the aerofoils on this one, which is 92 years old. And it was apparently made with broken beer bottle bottoms. So, bonus extra content, especially for Invasion Day. And this, I think I made this about 33 years ago when my trouble and strife was studying archaeology at university. And she had to show up for a residential segment of 2 weeks during the school holidays, and she had to bring an Aboriginal artefact made in the traditional fashion. And she showed up with this and she said, well, traditionally the men made the spears, so this is what my husband did. And when all three stingray stings were intact, 25 years or so before the boomerang carving stone was given to me to look after, according to the university, brother, I make a distinguished Aboriginal fish spear. You hear? And there's probably not too many white fellas who grew up in town who can say such a thing. But I suppose somebody has to try to learn how to fit into Australia. Despite having come from bloody Yorkshire 5 generations ago. I'm not living in Yorkshire now. No point trying to live like a friggin' Yorkshireman. Living in Australia. After 250 years of being ravaged by the harvest everythingists, it's probably bloody well past time that we started figuring out how to learn to live like traditional Australians. Learning to live on what's happy to grow wild on the land under our feet. It doesn't really matter whether we've got white feet or black feet. We all have to learn how to live within the limits of the remaining surviving biosphere, the ecology, which has not yet quite been wiped out by 250 years of hard-footed feral land lice, which were set loose to overgraze the landscape because the sheep and potato brigade felt such a deep need to meet Europe's demand for woolen cloth in order to make military uniforms, the better to defend themselves against each other and conquer the rest of the world. And otherwise spread the word of the God of thou shalt not kill, the Lord of do unto others as thou would have them do unto you, among the allegedly ignorant, godless, heathen barbarians who don't even know how to manage their own land, having kept it pristine and undisturbed for 40,000 years, having been there for 65,000 years, perhaps 120,000. And that's why I'm out here celebrating Invasion Day by walking barefoot among the food plants. And saying good day to the spiders. On 100 acres of Australia, which I have defended from the ravages of agriculture for 30 bloody years. And I'm out here doing this while the normal people, they're all singing Rule Britannia, marmalade and jam. 5 Chinese crackers up your arsehole, bang, 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 bang. Which is how I was taught to sing it in the 1960s, just before Britain abandoned the Commonwealth to join the European Economic Union. Think about it. Rule Britannia, marmalade and jam. Right? Prosperity for Britons in Britain, marmalade and jam. 5 Chinese crackers up your arsehole. Gunpowder was not discovered, developed or invented in Britain, was it? Gunpowder is a Chinaman's invention. Bang, 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 bang. Ever hear of the 2 Opium Wars or the Boxer Rebellion? Ever hear how England came to own half the world? Are pretty good at shooting people. Only stopping when title to the land was handed over to the Pommies. At the moment, there appears to be a growing groundswell of opinion among Australians that we should stop celebrating the 26th of January as being Australia Day. Partly because the Federation of Australia was not proclaimed on the 26th of January in 1788 when Governor Arthur Phillip planted a flag in the ground and proclaimed this place to be a British penal colony. Australia was proclaimed a federation on the 1st of January 1901. And the only reason that the British traditionalists haven't got the guts to celebrate Australia Day on Federation Day is because they've all already got a throbbing bloody hangover from getting pissed on New Year's Eve, and they're slept in and they don't want to get up and make speechifications. So I think we should celebrate Australia Day on Australia Day, which is Federation Day, which is New Year's Day. And I think if the Prison Guards Union wants to celebrate the proclamation of Australia as a penal colony, they can celebrate the 26th of January. And I think probably the correct day to celebrate Invasion Day would be the 29th of April. Because it was the 29th of April on 1770 that the Gweigal people were shot at by Captain Cook. 3 times, 2 rounds of ball into the ground either side of the blokes with the shield and the spears. 1 charge of birdshot into their legs, which convinced them that goody better are goody better. Fire sticks are fire sticks. It also convinced them that whitefellas were Gunyan badgers, shit eaters. Gunyan shit badger eater. Just saying. Happy Invasion Day. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Oh, bonus extra features. Carpet, beard, heath. About once every 5 years it puts out a little crop of juicy, sweet, tiny little 3mm across yellow and red berries. Delicious. If you can find that growing in a rainforest coop, you can probably stop logging operations because it's an endangered one. Hello, little fringe lilies in the heat of the day. Oh, has been 30. Well, that might be yesterday's. Call that yesterday's. 28 now. Got down to 16 overnight. Oh, I really hate global warming. Yes, I do. I hate global warming. Little spider. And the reason why global warming is so terribly bloody hateful is because it's optional. It was optional when I was born. It was optional when I was 10 years old. It was moderately stoppable when I was 20. And I think it's an inevitable catastrophic event now that I'm nearly 60. Rule Britannia, marmalade and jam. 5 Chinese crackers up your arsehole, bang, 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 bang. And when the Chinese destroy the Australian economy and then come to repossess the windmills, that might be quite a funny song. It might be nearly as funny as when the British Imperial troops were building a railway between Thailand and Burma, and somebody wanted them to sing, "Britons never, never, never shall be slaves." But that happened too. Ciao.